Hi, my name is Heather Hudson. I have the pleasure of serving as one of your school board attorneys here in Bay County. The superintendent has asked me to address a couple of issues with you today from new legislation that may have an effect on you in your classroom. But first and foremost, I want to thank you sincerely for all that you do. I am a proud Bay District Schools graduate, and I come from a family full of educators. I am grateful every day for the opportunities that were afforded to me based on my access to a high-quality public education right here in Bay County. Today we are going to cover a couple of key pieces of legislation. First up is the Parents' Bill of Rights. The laws we're going to talk about today actually came to be from 2 years of legislation. In 2021, the legislature created the Parents' Bill of Rights, which set forth a long list of rights reserved to parents, and in 2022, the legislature expanded those rights and added some enforcement mechanisms. This list is a summary of some of the rights included in the original Parents' Bill of Rights last year. Most of these strike me as pretty common sense or obvious. I think we would all assume that parents have the right to direct the upbringing of their children and to enroll them in school. But there are some on this list that jump out at me as a bit less obvious. For example, the right to not have your children recorded on video or audio without written consent. We all have high-powered cameras in our pockets these days, and I know it has become commonplace for us to pull out our phones and capture things as they happen around us. But I would caution you against pulling out your phone to capture a video, for example, of a student's behavior without written consent from the parent to do so. The Parents' Bill of Rights was further expanded this year in a number of ways. We're going to talk about a few of them today, starting with required communication with parents. The law now requires that the school provide notice to a parent anytime that there is a change in services or monitoring that is related to the student's well-being and that's related to the school's ability to provide access to a safe and supportive learning environment. The school is expected to respect and reinforce parents' fundamental rights to direct the upbringing of their children, and to encourage and facilitate discussions between students and their parents regarding issues related to a student's well-being. So what does this all mean? We wanted to provide you some real-life examples to help illustrate what we're talking about here. The first step is whether we are talking about something that impacts a student's health and well-being. That's kind of a gatekeeper. And if we are, then we look to whether we are changing any services or monitoring at the school setting as a result. So say you have a student who is having a hard time getting to class on time at a particular period and has a habitual tardy for that class. But it turns out that the student is experiencing some anxiety that's resulting in difficulty making that transition. Or perhaps in the elementary school setting, you have a student who is having a hard time transitioning from special area back to class, also due to anxiety. If your school counselor or a teacher is going to regularly check in with that student around the time of that transition to help ensure that the student gets where she needs to be and is doing okay, that could certainly be a service or monitoring that you're providing. At that point, the law simply requires that we provide notice to a parent that you're doing this. But what about some stickier situations? What if a student has disclosed to school staff that they're questioning their sexuality or gender identity? What if they also tell you that they haven't shared this with their parents? First and foremost, when dealing with more personal topics such as sexual activity, especially related to minors who do not have the ability to consent to such, I want one of your first thoughts to always be, is this a potential issue of child abuse or neglect that I need to report to DCF? If it is, make the call. But in addition to that, we need to consider whether we're talking about making substantial changes in the school setting and whether we need to be reaching out to the parents. Okay, I'm finally going to acknowledge the elephant in this room. The bill we're talking about is what was called in the media headlines as the Don't Say Gay bill. I know that there are fears and concerns that school staff are now required to immediately call a parent if a student identifies him or herself as LGBTQ, or the fear that you cannot under any circumstances talk with students about LGBTQ issues. Fortunately, that is not what the law says at all. You are not required to out every student to his or her parents just because you happen to know about the student's identity or orientation. For example, let's say that I'm a volleyball coach at a middle school. And while I am monitoring the halls in the class change, one of my athletes is walking down the hall holding hands with her girlfriend, and she excitedly runs up to me and says, "Hey coach, have you met my new girlfriend?" And then she carries on down the hall without any further discussion. Do I have to now call her parents and say, "Are you aware that your child is in a same-sex relationship?" Absolutely not. Just as I wouldn't call to tell them that she was dating Billy or John. I know that none of you got into education to police the love affairs of teenagers, and that has not changed. But what if my athlete had come to me after practice one night and had a heartfelt conversation with me to say that she's struggling with her sexuality and she has questions and anxiety about talking to anyone about it? Well, is she asking for any type of modification or services or monitoring in the school setting? Does she need us to make adjustments to ensure that she has an access to a safe learning environment? If not, then I am not required to call and out my athlete to her family. But let's say that I'm a school counselor and I have a young student coming to my office to talk on a weekly basis because the student is struggling with their gender identity. Or say a student wants us to use different pronouns or give them access to different restrooms or locker rooms. Then we're getting into the territory of monitoring and services, and your school administrators need to be brought into the conversation, and we probably need to be having a conversation with the family. As a teacher, I may not always have to disclose what a student has shared with me, but I do need to be upfront with him about the fact that I may not be able to keep things he tells me confidential. When a student starts to discuss a sensitive topic like this, I might lead with something along the lines of, "Thank you for trusting me with this information. Is this something you've talked to your parents about?" Before you say more, I want you to know that I may have to share this with your parents someday, but we can help you navigate that. If they are reluctant or afraid to talk to their parents, maybe I can direct them to the student to the school counselor's office, where they can assist in role-playing or facilitating a tough conversation with their family. What I would hate to see happen is that a student discloses something to a trusted adult at school and later feels betrayed or blindsided because that adult had no choice but to share that information with the student's parents. Hopefully being upfront about that issue can help avoid that result. Please note that I am also not telling you that you cannot notify a parent of any of these scenarios. I trust that you all will use your professional judgment to determine when a phone call or letter home is needed to communicate with a parent, even when that notification is not required by law. I am sure that you have conversations with parents every day that are not mandated by any statute. The Parents' Bill of Rights does not ever prohibit sharing information with a parent. Nothing included in this training should be understood as a prohibition against communicating with families. We are simply covering examples of when notification is actually required by law versus when you can exercise your own judgment. Although it is my understanding that the legislature was really focused on the types of examples we just went through, they painted with a rather broad brush, and I'm afraid they may have brought other issues into this requirement. For example, you'll see in the coming school year that you're going to have some new processes and forms related to MTSS behavior. A phone call and a letter will go home when a student enters or exits either Tier 2 or Tier 3. The notification will alert the parent to all of the potential services and monitoring that may be implemented in that tier. If there is a change in strategy within a tier, that doesn't necessarily require an additional formal notification. But if we're changing tiers and implementing a strategy that was not included in the last notification, we'll need to do that again. There is one big exception to providing notice to parents. In the event that you have a reasonable and fact-specific belief that alerting a parent will lead to abuse, abandonment, or neglect, then a notification is not required. For example, if a student credibly reports to you something like, "My father will beat me within an inch of my life if he knows about this," or "My parents will put me out on the street if they know this," then that is not a situation where we need to alert the parent and put the child at that risk. However, this isn't a decision that you get to make on your own or keep to yourself. If you're going to withhold information from a parent, that decision has to 1. Be approved by your principal, 2. Be documented in the student's education records, and 3. Be annually reviewed. So please communicate early and often with your school administrators if you have this type of concern. Okay, we're changing gears to another topic covered by House Bill 1557, and that is classroom instruction. As of this year, there shall be no instruction on gender identity or sexual orientation in grades kindergarten through 3. I sincerely doubt that any of you have any lesson plans for those grade levels on these topics, but if you do, this is the year to retire them. For grades 4 through 12, instruction on these topics must simply be age-appropriate and developmentally appropriate. The State Board of Education is set to adopt rules in the coming year defining what age-appropriate and developmentally appropriate mean. But in the meantime, please continue to use your professional judgment and stick to the benchmarks and standards, and you will be fine. Note, of course, that these topics are neutral, so instruction regarding opposite sex attraction is just as much instruction on sexual orientation as would be instruction on same-sex attraction. So the statute limits instruction on these topics. But what is instruction? Unfortunately, the legislature did not define that for us, but I've pulled a couple of dictionary definitions as a baseline. I know you all know what instruction is, as it's what you do every day, but when we're parsing words in this statute, it may help to recall that instruction is the process of teaching and engaging students with content or providing detailed information about how something is done. So if you're providing specific literature and a lesson on the topic of marriage equality, then this would be instruction. But let's talk about some examples of what is not instruction. Putting a family photo on your desk. A photo of my husband, daughter, and I on my desk is not instruction on heterosexual marriage, nor would it be instruction on same-sex marriage if I had a photo of my wife, my daughter, and I on my desk. Referring to your spouse's gender. Again, mentioning that I went to Target with my husband over the weekend is not instruction on heterosexual marriage. Extracurricular activities. We're not required to shut down gay-straight alliances, spectrum clubs, book fairs, tutoring, etc. Conversations had in those settings are not classroom instruction. Responding to a student's description of their family. For example, say you have a kindergartner who shouts out, "I have 2 moms." I can imagine a kindergarten teacher saying, "Well, that's great, honey. Every family is different and special," and then moving on. And that's not instruction. I can only imagine the interesting things kindergartners share throughout the day, but it's not instruction to respond and continue on with the lesson. We don't have to ignore or invalidate that student's family to steer clear of this law. We just can't launch into a lesson on marriage equality in response. Incidental references in literature. It's perfectly fine that the novel your class is reading may have incidental references to LGBTQ characters or issues. Providing grades and feedback when a student chooses an LGBTQ topic for an essay. Say a student chooses the Stonewall riots as a topic for their history fair project. No problem. That student's teacher and history fair judges can and should provide feedback just as they would for any other project. The state has provided its own interpretation of the law and explained that none of these examples fall under the definition of instruction. Okay, now we're going to transition to another topic that is covered by the Parents' Bill of Rights. The new language in the law specifies that parents must have the ability to accept or reject each individual school health service and screening that's offered. All that means for you is that you'll see a new version of the form getting sent home this year, and when it's time to take your class for regular screenings for things like scoliosis, vision, hearing, etc., we'll have a process in place to help determine which students should be included. It will also be more important than ever to get as many of these forms back from parents as possible. Your PanCare health techs will be following up with the families multiple times and putting data into focus to show which students have consent for which services. Last up is another new law that the superintendent wants you to be aware of. House Bill 7 was dubbed the Individual Freedom Bill by the legislature, and it puts limitations on trainings and classroom instruction. You may have heard references to this bill in the media using the terms critical race theory, but the bill does not include that phrase anywhere in the text. What it says is that no classroom instruction should promote or compel a student to believe certain things, such as that they are responsible for the past actions of others, that by virtue of their race or gender they should receive adverse treatment due to the past actions of others, that they should feel guilt or anguish over the actions of others. Essentially, instruction must at all times be presented in a manner that is objective and does not endorse these ideas. Nothing has changed about the standards or benchmarks related to instruction on past and present oppression or discrimination. You are still expected to teach and lead discussions on these hard topics. These discussions may very well lead to some students facing hard truths and having an emotional reaction. That is perfectly natural and acceptable. You simply must not present the material in a way that compels students to have such a reaction. These discussions may very well lead to some students facing hard truths or having an emotional reaction. That is perfectly natural and acceptable. You simply must not present the material in a way that compels students to have such a reaction. The answer to that appears to be the directive that the material must be presented in an objective manner. I am no teacher, but I struggle with the idea of how to present slavery or the Holocaust in a manner that is objective. But I am told that if you stick to the benchmarks and the approved instructional materials, you will be fine. When in doubt, you can always reach out to your administrative team, including district administrators such as Elena Simmons and Carrie Weatherly. Thank you for spending some time with me today on these topics. I hope that I have provided some helpful guidance to help you navigate the year ahead, but I recognize that I have probably left you with more questions than answers. These laws are so new and we have so little guidance that we just don't have all of the answers yet. The State Board of Education is expected to put out new rules interpreting these statutes and providing additional guidance in the year to come. For now, this is all we know, but I am sure that as more develops, that the superintendent and his staff will provide updates to you going forward. Thank you again for all that you do for our children, including mine, who is a proud BDS student. I hope you have a wonderful year.